All right, it is now 12:02, and I am going to go ahead and get us started. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. My name is Carly Griffith. I am the Water Program Director at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, which is the host for today's conversation. MCEA is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we depend on donors like you to fuel our work to protect Minnesota's environment, its natural resources, and the health of its people. Today's webinar is focused on wetlands, but all of our ecosystems are increasingly under threat, and we need committed people like all of you to sustain the long-term fight it will take to protect them. Please make a gift to support our work today. There's a link in the chat. So let's get started. Today's webinar is on the role of wetlands in Minnesota and what we need to do to protect them amid deep federal cuts. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to briefly paint a picture of Minnesota's treasure trove of these unsung heroes, which, as our panelists will detail later, filter pollution from our water, protect our climate, sustain wildlife, and buffer communities from floods. With over 10.5 million acres, Minnesota is the third leading wetland state in the country, trailing only Alaska and Florida's Everglades. Wetlands stretch across 20% of our state, with significant concentrations in Minnesota's northern peatland preserve and the western prairie pothole region. We used to have more wetland acres, actually almost double what we have now, but about 10 million acres have been lost over the last century. The majority have been artificially drained or filled for urbanization and agricultural development. The losses have been particularly dramatic in southern and western Minnesota, where some counties have lost an average of 95% of their natural wetlands. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency says wetland loss has been a significant factor in poor water quality in rivers and lakes in those parts of the state. Other threats to our treasured wetlands exist as well. For example, the proposed construction of a copper nickel sulfide mine upstream of Lake Superior would, if approved, result in the largest permitted wetland destruction for a single project in state history. I say all of this to underscore a few key points. First, Minnesota can't afford to lose more of our wetlands. We must protect what we have left. Second, the federal government is proposing to gut protections for wetlands across the country, and Minnesota must act if we want to ensure that ours are protected in the face of those cuts. And finally, if Minnesota does this right, we can create a roadmap for other states on how to respond in this moment. So I'm going to turn now to our panelist introductions. We are honored to have experts from the Nature Conservancy, Pew Charitable Trusts, and MCEA with us today to talk about this issue. Our panelists have a deep well of expertise to share with all of you today, but we don't cover all perspectives on this issue, and your questions at the end of our conversation will help us surface additional angles to consider. Dr. Chris Lenhart is a restoration ecologist at the Nature Conservancy and a professor at the University of Minnesota. He has led assessments and designs of stream and wetland restoration projects throughout the state and developed statewide wetland assessment tools. Thanks for being here, Dr. Lenhart. Next, we have Andrew Worthman. Andrew is a Midwest consultant at the Pew Charitable Trusts who focuses on peatland protection and restoration here in Minnesota. Thanks for joining us today, Andrew. And finally, we have Dr. Andrew Hillman, MCEA's Water Resources Specialist, who recently defended his PhD in Environment and Resources at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Andrew has been leading MCEA's work to push Minnesota to strengthen its wetland rule in its upcoming rule revision. So before I hand it over to our panelists, I want to give all of you a brief roadmap for our discussion. First, Chris Lenhart will kick things off by discussing the many benefits of wetlands for our water, our wildlife, and our communities. Next, Andrew Worthman will focus on the unique climate benefits of wetlands and in particular peatlands in Minnesota. And then finally, Andrew Hillman will outline the threats our wetlands face from proposed federal cuts and explain the opportunity that Minnesota and all of us have to strengthen our state wetland protections in the face of those cuts. Finally, we will aim to reserve 10 to 15 minutes at the end for your questions. So without further ado, up first, Dr. Lenhart will talk about Minnesota's many wetland types and why they're so important to protect.
Okay, thanks, Carly. It's good to be here. Just give me a minute while I get my PowerPoint presentation up. Yeah, I'll be, as Carly mentioned, giving a background on more of the wetland benefits from a bigger picture, especially about hydrology, water quality, and wildlife. So yeah, I work with the Nature Conservancy and the University of Minnesota, as Carly mentioned. And just to start off, though, with wetlands, what are they exactly? So wetlands are, permanently or temporarily wet areas. It's shallower than lakes. They only have to be wet for part of the growing season. They don't have to be wet all the time, just surprising to some people not working with them. They come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. This is a cypress bog here. I'm not from Minnesota, but one of my favorite types. Yeah, these are some of the different types of peatlands and wetlands that we have in Minnesota. These are wetlands that occur more on mineral soils, which are your kind of regular, typical soil, not organic matter. But so we have mineral soil wetlands, swamps, marshes, and then we have other types of wetlands that we call peatlands, which occur on these organic soil wetlands. And there are different types of those. Bogs, fens are two of them. And other panelists will talk about those more later. We also have floodplains, which are very important for the flood reduction benefits. I'll talk a little bit about those here in the following slides. But first, yeah, before talking about wetland benefits, it's important to remember that not that long ago, wetlands were, public enemy number one in a lot of parts of the world. I grew up in the Great Black Swamp region of Northwest Ohio, where they were not thought of fondly, let's say, and until not more recently, they are, starting to. The picture on the left was from a Wisconsin Wetlands Association presentation I found online about, brochure to promote draining of wetlands for agriculture. And there was a predominant mindset, and we still have a lot of drained wetlands, and some of those are obviously needed for agriculture, but we drained a lot of them. So there's a need to protect and restore the ones, that we have and restore more of them. And so it's evolved into this attitude that wetlands are wonderlands and have, a lot of benefits. So these are some of the benefits you commonly hear. They provide flood control, help recharge groundwater. They provide water purification or filtration, erosion control, wildlife habitat, as well as supporting recreation for people like kayaking in some of the deeper swamps, research and education. We'll give a couple examples of those, and economic vitality in some cases. And, more recently, we started talking about these climate change benefits because a lot of carbon is stored in wetlands, especially peatlands. And Andrew will talk about that more in his presentation. But that's been a more recent thing in the last couple decades, but has become a much bigger focus of the wetland work, both protection and restoration. But yeah, at first, I was talking about flood benefits. So wetlands, they do provide a lot of benefits, but not every wetland can do everything. And the different wetland types provide benefits, differing degrees, depending on, how they are. So some water bodies or wetlands that are already full of water aren't able to store as much water and don't do as much, at reducing floods. Other types of wetlands like these floodplains, shown from the Eggers and Reed Wetland Guide from Minnesota and Wisconsin, they store, tons of water. A floodplain can go from being totally dry, water about 6 feet below the ground, to under 10 or 15 feet of water in some of our larger rivers like the Minnesota River, Mississippi River floodplains. most of them do something to help store water and reduce floods, but so it depends on the type. Uh, Wetlands also do a lot for pollution removal, and these, the benefits of pollution removal also depends on the type of wetlands to some extent. And we'll show some slides about that too. But one of the biggest problems we have in the Midwest is the runoff from farmland and other areas, which carries pollution down to the Gulf of Mexico, and it causes this dead zone. So you get algae blooms, and then the algae die. They consume oxygen. It creates a area that's so low in oxygen that not a lot of life can live there. And so a lot of that is coming from the nitrogen in fertilizer runoff. The phosphorus contributes more to the algae blooms in lakes and fresh waters further upstream. So there's been a lot of work to help store some of that water and treat it. One of the projects we worked on a number of years ago at the university was this Fields to Stream guide. This is available free online from the University Extension. It's about managing water in rural areas. This guide was more about just the storage, the physical storage of water. As you can see that wetland in that picture there is deeper. This was for both kind of deeper ponds and wetlands, but they both do a lot of work in holding water and removing those nutrients that are really important for downstream water quality. Some of the other types of wetlands are prairie potholes. So these are the ones down in especially southern western Minnesota and throughout the Great Plains, Iowa, Dakotas, they're in those areas too. They do a lot for water quality, flood storage, and wildlife habitat. This one pictured here on the left is a wetland I studied in my PhD thesis a number of years ago down near the Iowa border. So you can see how much water this thing is holding. Up on the left is when it's full in the spring, and then on the lower right, it's totally dry. This would be holding up to 5 feet of water over in both basins. I think it was 80 acres in two basins. So it really held a lot of water, did a really good job of removing nitrogen. And also there are just tons of ducks, on these wetlands. And this is a picture from this actually isn't that wetland. That's the one from Nebraska. But yeah, I often would see tons of ducks and other types of wildlife. These types of basins, they're called potholes because they're little kind of basins that were formed by glacial features that often are only temporarily wet, and they'll dry up later in the fall. Nature Conservancy has worked on protecting and restoring a lot of these types of basins in central and western Minnesota, especially with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recently. There's a lot of other wildlife benefits as well. Those prairie potholes are really great habitat for like frogs and turtles. Where you have the basins that don't have really deep water and they don't have fish, they're really great for frogs because they don't get the fish eat the tadpoles and things. So those shallow basins are actually really great habitat for frogs as well, and turtle habitat. But another example I want to show here is an area where I've worked. So currently, we're working, Nature Conservancy, University, and a bunch of partners are working up in the Saxon Bog, which is northwest of Duluth, about 30, 40 minutes. It's been really great for a lot of reasons. This was restored. There was existing wetland, and then a big chunk of it was restored, thousands of acres, about 10 years ago. And in addition to all the water kind of benefits we mentioned already, what was surprising was just all the bird life that came back and became this birding mecca, really. People come from all over, so it's been not only, water and wildlife boon, but also, good for the local economy in terms of people coming to visit it. This picture here shows the great gray owl, which is one of the ones that attracts people to come. It's kind of rare in this region, but it occurs up there. And then that's just a slide from the Friends of Saxon Bog group that hosts a lot of birding trips and things in that area. And yeah, and actually that's all I had. So I'll wrap up there, and I think are we holding questions till the end?
Yeah, so if everyone can submit their questions as we go, there is a Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I will look at them as they come in, and I will ask some of our panelists at the end. So thank you so much, Dr. Lenhart,
Yeah, thank you.
For that introduction to our wetlands and why they're so important to protect. And up next, Andrew Worthman will speak on Minnesota's peatlands and why they are natural powerhouses to help us combat climate change.
Thank you, Carly. Hello, everyone. Andrew Worthman. So I wanted to first just share a personal story. I grew up actually in uh, Polk County, Wisconsin, on a farm. In fact, we could see Minnesota from our kitchen table. And for those who don't know, it's a biologically rich place full of lakes and rivers and wetlands and peatlands. I mean, it's all within the St. Croix River watershed. But back then, I had no idea I was living next to so many peatlands because that's not really how we talked about them. To us, they were basically swamps and places that we essentially tried to avoid and tried to farm around. What I didn't realize until much later is that many of the farms in Polk County, including fields I walked on every day, were built right on top of peat soils. However, when peat is drained, when it's plowed and exposed to air, something irreplaceable is lost. I grew up surrounded by these landscapes without really understanding what was just below my feet. And looking back, I see my home county in northern Wisconsin as kind of a perfect example of both the opportunities and the challenges that peatlands face. And it's why the remaining peatlands we have really need our support. This connection to peatlands isn't unique to me. In Minnesota, people are connected to the land, including peatlands in so many different ways, including growing food, hunting and fishing, hiking through wild places, or simply living alongside them. So today, I want to walk you through a few things. First, what makes peatlands so remarkable, why they matter for our water, our climate, and our communities. I want to then talk about the very real pressures that they are facing, from centuries of drainage to the growing threat of wildfire and development. I'll also share where Minnesota is already making a lot of progress with new state policies and on the ground work underway. And finally, what it will take to move from these first steps to the kind of lasting large scale protection and restoration our peatlands desperately need, including making sure we get the Wetland Conservation Act rulemaking right for peatlands. Because the truth is, when we lose peatlands, we lose a piece of what connects all of us to this place. Before we go further, let's be clear about what peatlands are and what peat is. So peat is actually partially decayed plant material. In most forests, you'll notice dead leaves and plants break down relatively quickly. But peatlands are different in that the ground is incredibly wet and oxygen poor. And so the decomposition slows essentially to a crawl. So plant matter essentially accumulates then over centuries, century after century, creating that dark, spongy soil that you think of. Peatlands often look, if you're seeing them, like a soggy meadow or mossy tree-dotted landscapes. But beneath the surface, there can be anywhere between 5 to 10, even up to 35 feet of soil, a true living archive of carbon that has been built up since the last ice age. The truth is that right now, Minnesota's peatlands are in trouble. And because Minnesota has more peatlands than any other state in the country, in the lower 48, over 7 million acres across the state, what happens in Minnesota impacts globally. And so the biggest threat that peatlands face is this long history of drainage, which Chris talked a little bit about. So a century ago, essentially, ditches were dug across vast areas of the state to turn those peatlands into farmland. Most of those projects failed, but the ditches remain and they continue to drain water, drying out the peat and releasing stored carbon into the air. Even today, between 800,000 and 1 million acres of peat are still actively being drained, and nearly 600,000 acres have been completely converted to crops and pastures. Fully drained peatlands are now the fourth largest emitter of greenhouse gases in Minnesota, and that's just behind vehicles. But drainage is not the only stressor. Climate change is also making things a lot worse. So think about hotter summers, more extended droughts, and intense wildfires. When a peatland dries out, it can catch fire and burn underground for weeks. And this was something that we saw with the Greenwood fire back in 2021 and the Jenkins Creek fire last spring. That's a photo of what it looks like after a wildfire on the left there. And there is a hidden cost to this. When peat is drained and exposed to air, it starts to decompose fast. And that releases carbon dioxide, turning a natural carbon sponge into a pollution source. And the smoke that you breathe from a peatland fire is highly toxic, much more so than typical wood fire. So we're not just losing habitat in wild places when we lose peatlands, we are losing one of the best natural defenses we have to climate change. And that's why protecting Minnesota's peatlands means protecting Minnesota's water, its wildlife, and its climate future all at once. Let's talk about what peatlands, what actually healthy peatlands do, because it is extraordinary. And so first I want to talk about water, which is that peatlands, if you think of them, they're like giant sponges. They hold hundreds of thousands of gallons per acre. That's helpful because it slowly releases water during drought periods, and it reduces floods after exceedingly heavy rains. Peatlands also filter pollutants and help prevent mercury from reaching Minnesota's lakes and rivers. That helps our drinking water. And when we talk about carbon, this is where peatlands quietly do some of the most important work. So for perspective, peatlands cover just 3% of the Earth's land surface, yet they store more than 30% of all of its carbon. And that's more than twice the carbon that is stored in the world's forest combined. Just think about that. In Minnesota, the numbers are equally staggering. The state's peatlands hold an estimated 4 billion metric tons of carbon. That's roughly 37% of all carbon in the state on land. And to put that in perspective, that equals the annual emissions of over 3 billion gasoline-powered cars. But here's the key to this. That carbon is only secure as long as the peatlands stay wet. Once it's drained, the carbon starts escaping into the atmosphere year after year for decades and even centuries. This is why scientists and policymakers are now calling peatlands among the Minnesota's best natural defenses against climate change. And unlike many climate solutions that require new technology, protecting and restoring peatlands can be done now with the tools that are already available. The good news is that Minnesota has already started recognizing the importance of peatlands. Updated climate action framework, for those of you who saw, was released a couple months ago. That 2026 framework explicitly identifies peatlands as vital to meeting the state's 2050 climate goals and shows how restoring half of the state's peatlands, that would be roughly 500,000 acres, would significantly reduce carbon pollution. The legislature also took action back in 2023. Lawmakers funded the Peatland Resilience Program within the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, the DNR. They also supported the University of Minnesota in research to better understand peatland hydrology and carbon dynamics, where the carbon is. And most directly relevant to the rulemaking on the Wetland Conservation Act, the legislature directed the Board of Water and Soil Resources to specifically incorporate peatlands into impacts, to show impacts within the Wetland Conservation Act rule revision. So these are all important steps, thinking about climate action framework, the legislature funding programs, Department of Natural Resources and Board of Water and Soil Resources doing this commendable work. However, we need to see progress that matches the urgency and magnitude of this situation. We think one of the best ways to scale up protection and restoration of peatlands across Minnesota is through the update to the Wetland Conservation Act. But first, let's look at why the current law falls short. So Minnesota's Wetland Conservation Act, passed in 1991, was designed for many types of wetlands, but it misses the mark on peatlands. The law essentially has three pillars: avoid, minimize, and replace. The model is a no net loss of wetland acres and functions. Essentially, you drain 1 acre, you build another acre nearby, and over time, you roughly replace the water storage and wildlife habitat. But that model also assumes all wetlands are roughly the same, and they are not. So under the current Wetland Conservation Act rules, a drained peatland and a restored prairie pothole, which Chris talked about earlier, can be treated as roughly equivalent in some contexts. But underneath the surface, they couldn't be more different. So you cannot simply replace 8,000 years of accumulated peat by digging a new wetland somewhere else. That's why the rule revision we think is very important. Getting it right means recognizing the unique value and role that peatlands play in ensuring Minnesota's climate resilience. So what a strong peatland policy could look like in the Wetland Conservation Act rule is something I'd like to talk a little bit more about. I think first is that we should be using the best available science. Well, Minnesota has new high resolution peatland data, and the Board of Water and Soil Resources should be using that data to examine how proposed projects may impact ancient carbon stores, sometimes called carbon stocks, because damage to those stocks doesn't just release carbon, it causes a whole set of downstream water problems, including mercury pollution. With that information, projects should be designed to minimize impacts on peatlands. Second is if impacts are truly unavoidable, so think about emergency road repairs, then mitigation must fully account for the loss of carbon and other benefits. For example, that could mean placing nearby intact, healthy peatlands into permanent conservation to offset the damages. Third is identifying and protecting the highest value intact peatlands. So using that same data, the state should map kind of areas that are healthy, irreplaceable peatland areas that should be off limits to future development. And fourth is tightening existing exemptions. We think it's important that we look at current rules that allow some of the activities such as building timber access roads. Right now, those can proceed without full review. And we think that because those can alter the natural hydrology of peatlands, especially during a spring thaw, for example, that those kind of exemptions actually should be tightened and there should be some more oversight. So these recommendations we think are targeted, they're scientifically grounded, and they are entirely consistent with what the Minnesota legislature has already asked for. So in closing, I hope you've gotten a sense of how much life and water and history are packed into these boggy stretches of land. Peatlands might not be the most flashy, but they're quietly doing very important work, keeping our water clean, soaking up floods, and storing carbon by the ton. They hold more importance than many realize, and I hope you leave today with a renewed perspective on their value, much like I did when I took the time to truly notice them. When I reflect back my days in Polk County, growing up on the farm there, and the peatlands that I walk by daily, I'm reminded that we can't reverse all of the effects of a generations of drainage, but we still have the power to safeguard what remains. We can restore many of the peatlands and protect the healthy, intact peatlands. Every action we take today really does shape that future. So no matter your background, I believe your voice matters in this next step. When the public comment period on the wetland conservation closes, hopefully you've had a chance to speak up and join other organizations across Minnesota to ensure that the Wetland Conservation Act recognizes peatlands as essential for water, storage, flood protection, and our shared heritage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I love that phrase you used to describe peatlands as a living archive of carbon that has accumulated since the last ice age. I think that's a very powerful and visceral image to leave us with. I would now like to introduce our final panelists before we get to your questions. I will note that I have seen many excellent questions come in through the Q&A chat, and we will have time for those at the end, so please keep those coming. And last but not least, Dr. Andrew Hillman will speak to us about Minnesota's upcoming rulemaking, so you'll get a little more of the nuts and bolts of what's happening and why it's more important than ever amid federal cuts.
Thanks, Carly. Yeah, so today I'm really going to go into the details of what this current rulemaking opportunity is and put it into perspective of what's been happening at the federal level in terms of wetlands and water protections. So over the past few years, federal protections for wetlands have been eroded by both court cases and recent agency decisions at the federal level. We'll start in 2023 with what's called the Sackett decision. So this was a Supreme Court ruling that removed Clean Water Act protections from many wetlands across the country, wetlands specifically which do not have a continuous surface connection with waters such as larger lakes and rivers. These so-called isolated wetlands provide all of the benefits that you've heard today from Andrew and Dr. Leonard, but they've lost federal legal protection. Unfortunately, these changes have already come to pass and they're reflected in current federal permitting decisions. So fast forward from 2023 to late 2025 into the present day, and we have the current federal administration looking to cut wetland and water protections even further, beyond the Sackett-based cuts even. So the EPA in Washington, D.C. is currently considering adopting new rules that would remove Clean Water Act protections from wetlands and streams that are not wet for the majority of the year, or perhaps for even ones that are not wet all year round. This is important because many wetlands, as we've talked about today, are only seasonally wet, and a rule like this ignores the realities of wetlands on the ground. Wetlands do not have to have ponds of water on them all year for them to be considered wetlands from a scientific perspective. And so proposing to regulate them in this way goes against the intent of the Clean Water Act, in our opinion. This has potential for devastating impacts across the nation, with many states, especially those out west, losing protections for up to 99% of their wetlands. Here in Minnesota, we stand to lose federal protections for up to 96% of our wetlands under the worst case scenarios. It really depends on how the EPA decides to proceed over the next few weeks. But regardless, the impacts will be devastating. This is why state level protections are so important. With federal protections to protect waterways and wetlands disappearing across the country, state laws are the backstop. These changes at the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers do not change the level of protection that states across the country can offer to wetlands. But as you can see from states in the red here on this map, many states in the US do not have adequate state protections for wetlands or other waters. Some states have reacted to these federal changes by passing laws to create or strengthen wetland protections, while unfortunately other states have passed laws recently to reduce state protections to match the lower federal ones. While migrating birds, insects, water, and climate do not follow state boundaries, we still need to do what we can to protect wetlands where we can. As other states look to protect their wetlands from these eroding protections, Minnesota can be a model for other states to look at if our regulations remain strong in opposition to these new gaps in protection. In fact, we want our regulations to counteract these new gaps. Minnesota is lucky to have the Wetland Conservation Act, as was mentioned earlier, which continues to protect wetlands in Minnesota. However, these new gaps in protection due to federal rollbacks need to be counteracted by our state's policy. If we want to remain a model for strong wetland protections nationwide, Minnesota needs to adapt its regulations today to meet the moment. And we have a chance to do just that with this current rulemaking opportunity. I'll step back a little bit and kind of explain what rulemaking is. So to provide some context, rulemaking is how state agencies convert state law, which is passed by the legislature, into actionable regulations. Legislation passed by our lawmakers can sometimes be broad, and rulemaking is how agencies interpret the law to make regulatory decisions. Rulemaking processes in Minnesota involve multiple opportunities for public comment throughout the process. And we're very lucky that the state is going to be opening rulemaking on our Wetland Conservation Act soon. And so now is a perfect opportunity to get our voice heard and push for the state to adopt the strongest possible regulations to protect wetlands and waters in Minnesota. The agency has in fact already released its draft rules, and we have identified a number of places where the rule can be and needs to be improved to protect wetlands across Minnesota. I will walk through a few of these shortcomings here. This is not an exhaustive list of improvements that need to be made to the Wetland Conservation Act rules. As you've heard today, other groups have identified issues on this rule related to peatlands and other issues that are also relevant today. So the first major shortcoming that I'd like to talk to you about in regards to the state agency's draft wetland rules are around something called intermittent and ephemeral streams. So intermittent and ephemeral streams means streams that do not flow all year round. Streams without flow all year round are commonly associated with Western states and drier climates. And while it's true that Western states have many miles of these streams, perhaps surprisingly to some of you, so does Minnesota. Minnesota is a headwater state with many miles of headwater streams that feed larger rivers, provide crucial habitat, and protect the health of the larger rivers that they flow into. Rain that falls in Minnesota flows to the Gulf of Mexico, to the Hudson Bay, and to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So as a headwater state, the protection of Minnesota waters has not only local implications, but national and global ones too. These headwater streams often do not flow all year round due to their position in the landscape. And so under the new federal plan for the Clean Water Act, these streams could lose all protection from pollution and development. Pollution and destruction of these streams that flow into larger rivers will lead to widespread negative water quality outcomes. Importantly, many of these headwater streams lack specific state regulations today. This has widespread potential impacts in Minnesota, with preliminary research suggesting that about half of all of Minnesota's stream miles not flowing all year round. Additionally, there's published research that estimates that almost a quarter of all water flowing from Minnesota into Western Lake Superior originates from streams that do not flow all year round. The loss of protection from pollution or destruction for these streams could have drastic consequences for one of the nation's most pristine watersheds and my personal favorite of the Great Lakes. Thankfully, the legislature has given the authority to the state to protect these streams under the Wetland Conservation Act rules. Unfortunately, the agency has declined to do so in the current rulemaking, stating that they will draft those rules later. However, the last rulemaking process for the Wetland Conservation Act happened in 2009. Federal rollbacks are happening today, and these ecosystems are losing protection today. We can't wait that long in Minnesota to protect these streams. The state has the authority and the explicit legislative direction to protect these ecosystems under our wetlands laws, and they need to do so as soon as possible. The second topic I'd like to talk to you about is around something called functional assessment. And this was alluded to by Andrew. And as we've heard from Dr. Lennart and Andrew today, wetlands provide many benefits to society and to the natural environment, but not all wetlands provide all of these values. These values and benefits are often referred to as functions in scientific settings. And so one place in the Wetland Conservation Act that we see that there could be great improvements made is that these benefits or functions are not adequately being measured as a part of the permitting process, and they're not being properly considered. There is even an agency-developed tool that's approved for the use of assessing what the functions and benefits of specific wetlands are, but nowhere in the current rules is it required to be used in any part of the permitting process when wetland impacts are being considered. This needs to change. One way that the Wetland Conservation Act protects wetlands, as we heard today, is by mandating the replacement of wetlands that are impacted by development. So in some circumstances, a developer might be allowed to destroy a wetland if it funds the creation or restoration of wetlands elsewhere in the state. However, under the current regulations and the way that the rules read, a peatland could theoretically be replaced by something like a wet prairie, even though these two wetland types provide homes to vastly different ecosystems with different biology and different hydrology. The agency needs to draft stronger rules that ensure that not only are we replacing the acres of wetlands that are impacted by our development, but we're replacing the specific values and benefits that wetlands provide. The DNR in the state of Minnesota has some evidence that although wetland acres across the state have not significantly dropped in the past 10 years, we are seeing losses in forested wetlands in the northern region of the state. Improving the wetland replacement plan process so that it better reflects the Act's goal of not only no net loss in acres, but of no net loss in value is a must. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about with this rulemaking process is the push for a public hearing. The agency is not planning on having a public hearing on this topic unless they are pushed to by the public. The hearing allows for a public forum to increase transparency and accountability for the agency. Given the backdrop of these federal rollbacks and how important this wetland law is to protect Minnesota's ecosystems, we believe that a rulemaking of this magnitude needs to have a public hearing. We want the agency to publicly explain their proposed rules and listen to their constituents and allow face-to-face discussions with the affected public, which in this case is everyone in Minnesota. As the agency moves forward with the rulemaking, be on the lookout for information from both MCEA and our partner groups here about easy ways to get your voice heard, ways to comment onto the agency about the shortcomings of the rule, and ways to stay informed on wetlands. It's important to note that the agency will likely be receiving comments from other interest groups, asking for weaker protections and easier routes to developing on wetlands. It's really critically important that the state also receives comments demanding strong, robust, and complete regulations to protect our most important resources in Minnesota. And lastly, I'll mention that local governments have a huge role to play here. In Minnesota, local governments, usually in the form of county soil and water districts, play a huge role in implementing the Wetland Conservation Act on a day-to-day basis. And local governments have the ability to draft their own more specific wetland protections. So stay involved with your local communities and push for wetland restoration and wetland protection where you live. It's important to remember that all waters are connected and that damages to certain waters always have the potential to damage all waters, and wetlands are no exception. So that's what I have today, and I thank you for listening, and I'll send it back to Carly.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists today. We have covered a lot of ground in the last 40 minutes. We've talked about all the work that wetlands do for us, the many different ecosystem services they provide, how we can turn some of the state's climate commitments into action, and why it's important to take advantage of this upcoming rule revision. We have also had a lot of excellent questions, close to 40 questions come in so far through the Q&A, and I would now like to make space for our panelists to address some of those questions. So to start off, a lot of questions have had to do with the topic of, what are other ways for people on the webinar today to get involved to protect local wetlands? We've talked a lot about this rule revision sometime this summer today, a very clear opportunity to submit a comment to the Board of Water and Soil Resources. What are other ways that people can get involved, whether to help support peatland legislation that Andrew Worthman suggested, or to learn how to better protect wetlands on their own private property? And I think I'll ask Andrew Worthman and Dr. Lenhart to answer this one.
You want to go ahead, Andrew?
Sure. So I think it is important if people have the opportunity to require or to request public hearing that Dr. Hillman talked about. I think that is one of the important ways to get involved. We've been working, the Pew Charitable Trusts has, with kind of leaders on the ground to help encourage the legislature to also look at different ways to scale up peatland protection and restoration. And one of those areas is thinking about school trust lands. So I saw a number of people asking about the role of public land. So school trust lands have over 1 million acres of peatlands, and for those that don't know, those lands are administered through the DNR, but they are for the benefit of school children. And so we've been thinking about, are there ways to both bring together protection and restoration on school trust lands within Minnesota, and also to leverage conservation finance? So that's things like leasing and carbon credits and things that are potentially helping to bring in revenue, but also pay for some of that restoration work. I think it is, though, important for the legislature and people in those positions to hear that you care deeply about peatlands. And so I always, kind of steer people to be talking with their legislators. There's also, there's other opportunities to get involved as well. Sometimes that looks like commission meetings. LCCMR is another place. They're making important decisions about where state monies go to help fund projects. I think those are kind of some of the first things that come to mind for me. But this Wetland Conservation Act rulemaking is really important.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I agree. I'd just say more locally, you can talk to your local SWCD or watershed district I mean, oftentimes if there's wetlands nearby, and get involved in volunteer invasive species removal. There's areas that aren't protected, talking to them. There are these more protective local plans that can be developed, the comprehensive wetland plans that I think watershed districts and other local governments can do. And so, yeah, so I think it's good to, be connected to your local areas too for, the hands-on kind of experience. But yeah, that's probably all I'll
Great.
say for now, but
Thank you both. So I have another question here that I think I'm going to give to Dr. Hillman, which is from a listener who is aware of the fact that part of the proposed rules from Bowser include a shift to the HGM or hydrogeomorphic classification system for wetlands. And the question is whether that will help or hurt the effort to better protect wetland values in addition to wetland acres. So Dr. Hillman.
Yeah, really great question. So I'd say on that we generally support the shift from an older type of wetland classification to this newer classification system called HGM or hydrogeomorphic method. We really don't see that as a impediment to progress in protecting wetlands, but there's one important caveat to that. The HGM classes of wetlands are not enough on their own to distinguish the different values that these different wetlands provide. Just because two wetlands are in the same HGM class does not necessarily mean that they're going to both provide the same level of water quality benefits or support the same type of biodiversity. And so it's really important that if the state is going to go through with switching to this HGM model, there needs to be a really robust functional assessment or benefits assessment that goes along with these type classifications. And that's one of the things we're pushing for in this rulemaking is to go in parallel with this classification system. We need measurements of what the benefits of these wetlands are. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so next question here is, what is the role of conservation easements in this work, especially for things like peatland protection on private land? And do we know how many of the still intact peatlands in Minnesota, that 7 million acres that you discussed, Andrew Worthman, are on public or private land?
I think first just wanted to highlight the program from the Board and Water and Soil Resources that works with private landowners, especially with peatlands that need to be restored. They have a funding program, the RIM program, that helps with long-term easements for private properties. And if you do a quick Google search, you'll be able to find that on their website. It's a really incredible thing that they're working both with soil and water conservation districts and the Board of Water and Soil. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head about the number of millions of acres that are private versus public, but it's fair to say that there's a good deal of both. One place that I often turn to for some of those numbers is the Nature Conservancy's peatland playbook, which is on their website. They have a little bit better breakdown of some of those numbers. A lot of cropland in the middle of the state, which previously had peatlands, is now mostly all been tilled up and is in that sort of growing crops, either corn, soybeans, or in pasture for the most part. But that doesn't mean, especially in areas where there are higher histosols, it doesn't mean that some of those areas couldn't be converted back to peatlands, working with some of the agencies like Board of Water and Soil. So there is potential to do that. A lot of it kind of depends on how degraded those soils are and what state they're in. But it's certainly an option even in the middle of the state if you're a farmer or a private landowner and you want to protect your peatland.
And it brings me to a related question that I think I want to direct to you, Dr. Lenhart, which is, how does one restore a drained peatland?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, good question. Yeah, so I mean, with most wetland restoration, you're undoing the drainage effects by blocking up ditches. And so you're there's some kind of water control structure, or if you can actually filling in the whole ditch is really helpful in peatlands. That solves a lot of the problems. So, there's blocking up the ditch, restoring the hydrology, that raises the water level back up. And that's been a lot of the work. There's also the vegetation part, and it takes a while to recover the native plant communities and their functions. Is some of the other questions I've asked about in here is like how long does it take to recover? Yeah, and so some peatland restorations, they do some vegetation restoration. On bogs, you're trying to get the sphagnum moss back, which is the kind of key species in bogs, and that can be a little tricky unless you have the hydrology just right and the peat conditions are just right. You can do cuttings, sprinkle it around to try to reestablish it. That's had kind of mixed success in Minnesota. There's seed mixes and other types of areas. Yeah, so it's a combination of hydrologic restoration, vegetation restoration, and then managing it and monitoring it over time, over years. Yeah, probably go on for a while, but that's probably good for now.
Yeah, Dr. Lenhart could definitely go on for a while. He's been a part of a lot of peatland restoration efforts statewide. So I would think we have time for 2 more questions today. Thank you again for all the excellent questions that have come in the chat, and we will try to do some kind of follow-up email to help direct you to resources that have come up on the webinar today, and provide some broad feedback to the variety of questions we weren't able to directly cover. So my second to last question, really for whoever would like to address it, is we've really focused on the role of wetlands in Minnesota in our webinar today. Do any of you have thoughts on how to protect transboundary or interstate wetlands that might cross state borders and therefore potentially, a state that does have state wetland protections and a state that doesn't? Any thoughts on that?
I have one thought. I think really projects like that do occur, and they really have to come from a place of governmental collaboration. There are many wetlands in this country that cross state boundaries or private public boundaries, and anytime you have a wetland crossing either a jurisdictional boundary or an ownership boundary, collaboration between the people that own the land or are in charge of the land is really key. So investment in upfront collaboration with the folks on the other side of whatever boundary it is are really crucial. And there's different examples to look towards. There's been successful examples of collaboration between state agencies and federal agencies who might share ownership or management of a single wetland unit, to make sure that the way they're managing the different sides of the wetland are from the same scientific perspective and are sharing the same needs. And so it's definitely something that can be tricky, but it has been done successfully. So that's good. I don't have anything specific, I guess, but I would say like a lot of communication and a lot of collaboration is necessary.
I'll just add to that. There is this great effort on the Peat Restore effort, which is a collaboration with USDA Forest Service and Michigan Tech, the Nature Conservancy, and University of Minnesota, which brings together researchers and scientists and helps to share the kind of what research is happening on the ground in terms of peatlands in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and even beyond. And so oftentimes those are, I think, important ways to help connect people to some of the latest the latest on how to better protect and restore our peatlands. I also just mentioned, I think, I'm sharing with your member of Congress, wherever you happen to be, that we need to do a better job of protecting our wetlands and share that personal story. Like, talk about if you're hunting or fishing, like talk about why you feel wetlands matter and why they need your protection. But I think it's important for our federal legislators to once again double down on, like, this is important for our communities. We want you to do better.
And I'm going to cheat a little for my last question and ask a 2-part question. The first part, for you, Dr. Hillman, we've had some questions about, who do I contact to ask for a public hearing? And is the comment period currently open? So can you remind us of some of the nuts and bolts? And then finally, I would like each panelist, on that personal note that Andrew Worthman just mentioned, if each of you can tell us about one of your favorite wetlands in Minnesota, or Andrew Worthman, maybe in the Wisconsin border near Minnesota, to end us today. So Dr. Hillman first.
Thank you. Yeah, so some specifics on this comment opportunity. The agency has not yet decided when the comment period will open. Once it's open, it will be open for at least a few months, hopefully, and we'll get specifics around that hopefully soon. Our best estimate is that the comment period will open sometime this summer. And so really be on the lookout in your email inboxes from MCEA or Nature Conservancy or Pew Trusts and we'll be sending you information about when that comment period opens, alerting you of that, and providing ways for you to give your feedback in a relatively straightforward and easy way. So I hope that helps with some of the details there. We'll let you know as soon as we know.
And just for the question, Dr. Hillman, of who to ask for a public hearing.
You need to ask the Board of Soil and Water Resources in Minnesota. They are the agency that is in charge of promulgating these Wetland Conservation Act rules. And so if they receive enough comments from the public asking for a public hearing, they'll be required to do so. And so it's really important that we get as many people telling the agency that we want this to have a public hearing. Okay, so my favorite wetland. As Carly mentioned, I'm a recent transplant to Minnesota from Wisconsin, so I'll cheat a little bit and say my favorite wetland is Horicon Marsh. This is in eastern Wisconsin, kind of between Madison and Milwaukee, roughly. It's one of the largest continuous wetlands in the Midwest, and it's really just a beautiful place. So if you've never been to Horicon Marsh, I highly recommend it. In terms of Minnesota, I've only been here a few months, and I've been really busy wrapping up my dissertation, so I've not had the chance to get my feet wet, so to speak, with Minnesota wetlands. But the one I'm most looking forward to visiting is Sax-Zim Bog. So I'm a pretty big bird watcher, and I'm excited to go up there and see some owls this winter. So
I'll jump in next. So not too far across the border over in Luck, Wisconsin, is Straight Lake State Park, and Straight Lake is on the Ice Age Trail, and so there's rolling hills and water, and there's actually a fen there. You can see the peat, you can see the tamarack and spruce, and you can see how the water filters out of the fen and into the Straight Lake. So it's a really cool place to actually see on a pretty short hike what a healthy peatland looks like.
All right, yeah, so almost out of time here, but yeah, so I'll just say quick, my favorite one is the Harry Alexander Nature Center in Roseville, because it's the highest quality, but it's because where I spend a lot of time, and it has a boardwalk, so you can walk in there and feel like you're kind of out of the city, and it's a drained peatland that's still there and functioning, so it's kind of survived all these impacts and still there and still a nice place. And so let's go with that one. There's lots of them. It's a hard question.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you to our audience. We really appreciate that you're here today to learn about this issue and the excellent questions that you asked. As we heard today, this is a key moment for Minnesota's wetlands and for wetlands across the country, and there will be some important opportunities to engage this summer. So please stay tuned for future communications from MCEA and our partner organizations about how you can help push the state to adopt a strong wetland rule when the revision process opens this summer or later this year. Thank you again so much for your support of MCEA and our partner organizations through your donations. We genuinely cannot do it without you. Thanks all for your time.